Recently, I've been thinking a lot about time and how I'm using mine, and honestly, I'm not proud of what I see. YouTube videos are getting longer and longer, stories are being stretched into multiple feature films, and video games are becoming sweeping epics that take up hundreds of hours of our lives. The entities and institutions that once just vied for our money are now after a much more precious and finite resource, our time. In short, I'm worried not as much that I'm wasting my time, but that I just don't have enough of it. And as a creator, this fear and the pressure it places on me can be paralyzing. In the end, it only encourages me to distract myself even more. And if you're feeling the same way, then I know the perfect poet for our anxious souls, John Keats. John Keats died young, age 25, to tuberculosis, a terrible disease that he had already watched claim the life of his mother and brother. And sadly, just 2 years after caring for his dying brother Tom, Keats started coughing up blood and knew he was a doomed man. But 2 years before he started to show these symptoms, right before his brother died, Keats wrote one of his many glimpses into mortality, the poem, "When I have fears that I may cease to be." When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleamed my teeming brain, before high-pilèd books and charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone, and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. So if you've watched any of my previous videos on poetry, you know that I'm a firm believer that in order to understand a poem, you need to understand every word of the poem. Poems don't have a lot of words, so in order to understand them, you need to take the time to figure out what they all mean. As you can see, Keats uses some tough words, but I tried to put some definitions of the words that would be the most difficult for most students. And just in the first 4 words, you can see that the poem starts to kind of unlock itself a little bit. Words like gleaned, teeming, they tell us that Keats wants to gather up all these ideas in his brain. They're there, but it takes time to put them into the sort of works that you would put in storehouses or characteries. Keats wants to be a great poet, a great timeless writer, and in his own lifetime, he's not going to see that happen. He's going to see a glimpse of it, but he's not going to see that happen, and he's going to die believing that his teeming brain did not get harvested properly. So in this slide, I wanted to highlight 2 concepts that are really important in this poem, nature and love. Now, these concepts are not unique to this particular poem. Lots of poems talk about nature and love. However, the way in which Keats uses nature and love is quite interesting here. Let's first look at nature. So you've got the grain, the starry sky, the weather with the clouds, the shore, and the ocean that would go with it, obviously. And what's interesting for me about this nature is how, unlike other works of poetry, especially romantic works, nature is not giving the speaker any sort of comfort. Let's take a look at the biggest romantic work of them all, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Victor, the protagonist, is constantly going to the lake as a sort of balm for all the terrible things happening since he reanimated this corpse and how it's destroying his life. That's not what's happening for the speaker. Even in some other Keats poetry, such as Ode on a Grecian Urn, you can see the happy, happy spring and the boughs and the leaves and all that sort of stuff. And even though that has some really melancholy undertones, the nature is still rejoiced. It's happy. That's not the case here. And then if you look at love, yes, it's a love poem, but it's an unrequited love. Specifically, it's an unreflecting love that the speaker has for this fair creature of an hour. Only an hour, a short, brief amount of time. And love is one of the things that sinks to nothingness in the end of the poem. So this slide, I think, really illustrates what I would say is the central theme of this poem, maybe the central fear of the speaker, and that is lost opportunities. Unrealized potential drives these poems' images. So I tried to color code them here. Before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before the full ripened grain gets harvested. I may never live to trace the huge cloudy symbols of a high romance. Keats is living in one of the most proficient and exciting times in English literature, and he feels like he might very well die before he has a chance to contribute anything to it. Shifting kind of tone a little bit here, we have, I shall never look upon thee more, fair creature of an hour, never have relish, love. So in all of these, Keats is leaving the reader feeling very disjointed. It's all of these things that might happen, but the fear that when he ceases to be is that none of these things will have had happened. Rather, they are dreams unfulfilled, ambitions not reached, goals that are never accomplished, lost opportunities. So this lost opportunity sets up the poem's final couplet quite nicely. I put the last two and a half lines up here. Then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think till love and fame to nothingness do sink. And as I said below, this is an ending that's quite static as opposed to a dynamic ending or an ending that inspires something to happen, or you feel like the story continues in some way or is at least resolved. That's not here. Rather, the speaker is kind of paralyzed by this idea that there's only so much time in the world. And transience, which is this idea that we're temporary. It's not really an idea, it's a fact that we're temporary, that everything in this world, including us, dissolves into nothingness. This transience leads to an existential crisis that's just absolutely crushing. That love and art, the fame he talks about, the art that he hoped to capture from his teeming brain at the beginning of the poem, sink into nothingness. And I think we think of this existentialism as more of a 20th century idea, but here we are 200 years ago, and Keats is reflecting it very much in the way that we as modern readers maybe feel it. I definitely hinted at that at the beginning of this video, that for me personally as a creator, when I feel like I'm not using my time well, rather than inspire me, it kind of encourages me to just distract myself more because I don't want to think about it. Now, certainly that's not how everyone reacts. There's lots of stories of people who find out that maybe they don't have a lot of time left, or maybe they almost lost their lives but got a second chance, so to speak, and they're inspired to do amazing, beautiful things. So I think this is a real spectrum, and I'd be interested to hear from other creators, if that's something you want to share in the comments, what you think of this idea of our temporary nature and our desire to create beauty and inspiring works. Keats certainly is in the more depressing side of that spectrum. And yet, despite what can only be described as a very depressing ending, it's worth noting that Keats didn't voice these opinions to a friend in a passing conversation. He didn't scratch them down into a journal somewhere. He wrote them in a poem, specifically a Shakespearean sonnet, which, as you can see, has 14 lines of specifically rhymed iambic pentameter. This is not the sort of thing that even someone of Keats's caliber just naturally thinks in. It takes quite a lot of time. So I think it's interesting to note that even though he says fame sinks into nothingness, it doesn't completely paralyze him. When he has fears that he ceases to be, he writes about them and expresses them in poems. And even though Keats died very young, I think that might be where some of the hope of this poem is, that even our existential crises can be ways in which to, as Jason Silva says in a video, to defy entropy with our poems and our films. So I think that's something worth keeping in mind in the overall theme of this poem. Even though this poem didn't come out until almost 2 decades after Keats died, it's still something he very clearly, carefully worked on. In the end, I'm not sure if Keats was proud about how he spent the last of his light. His tombstone doesn't even bear his name, claiming rather that it marks the final resting place of one whose name was writ in water. And his will is a single line of iambic pentameter, my chest of books divide among my friends. So maybe creating art does little to lessen the pain, fear, and sadness of entering that undiscovered country. But there can be no doubt that Keats's final years were some of the most prolific in all of English literature. So maybe in that fear of not being, Keats unshackled himself from the pressure of fame and fortune. And with this freedom from the pressure to write his generation's mighty works, he chose to just write. After all, When I Have Fears is a poem about not having time to create great poems. Staring down the afterlife, knowing he would die, might just have helped Keats learn to live.